Welcome to our American Revolution lesson number 19. We're actually going to get started today with just a few opening questions, reaching back, thinking about some previous topics we have discussed. Question number 1. Can you finish Patrick Henry's famous quote? As for me, give me blank or give me blank. Do you remember the words that go in those two blanks? Did you say, as for me, give me liberty or give me death? Those were his famous words. Number 2, who disguised herself as a man to join the Continental Army? Remember, we learned about her when we were studying the importance of women and their roles during the American Revolution. She disguised herself as a man, helped fight in the army when women weren't really allowed, got wounded and was eventually found out by the doctor who was caring for her wounds. Yes, you got it. Her name, Deborah Sampson. Number 3, name one country that became an ally to the American side. Now, scholars, there are 3 possibilities here. One of them, the Netherlands. One of them, Spain. The third one, secretly helping but did become an ally, France. Did you name one of those 3? If so, great job. Number 4 is reaching way back in our study. A blank is a formal written request signed by several people asking for something to change. You might recall it was the Continental Congress who wrote this formal request, and those delegates signed it, asking for King George, right, to restore their rights and stop the mistreatment of the colonists. Yes, that formal written request is called a petition. Well done, scholars. So, moving into our work for today, lesson 19, we will learn about where the fighting spread beyond the New England colonies. You'll find out that's to the south and even out at sea, in the ocean. Right? And we will learn about a traitor, probably the most famous traitor maybe even in history. Let's get started. So the fighting in the American Revolution had primarily been in the New England colonies, right? The northern colonies. Think of that area, right? New York City, Boston, into Philadelphia, right? That's moving a little more into the middle colonies. But much of the South was people who were loyalists, right? Georgia especially, right, thought of itself as being more loyal to Great Britain than to its fellow colonies. But as the American Revolution continued, fighting did move into the South. Britain had captured a large part of the South, and that happened while a lot of the fighting was going on in the North. Here was an American strategy to try to fight against this taking over of the South. Their strategy was to have only small battles, right? Never big battalions of the army, just small battles, few soldiers, using a tactic called guerrilla warfare. Now, it's not the guerrilla like an animal gorilla when we read The One and Only Ivan, if that was one of your reading books. This is a different kind of guerrilla. Guerrilla warfare is a type of fighting that is based on the idea of popping out of hiding for a fight and then quickly retreating and hiding again. Right? So think of it as like a jack-in-the-box, right? You pop out, you fight, you have a battle, and then you retreat. You hide. You don't stay and keep fighting, right? You stay on the move, surprise attacks, and keep moving. guerrilla warfare. That strategy is meant for them, the Americans, to not get fully defeated in any battles. Now that they've been experiencing some success, they want to continue that into this fighting that's going on in the South. One of the key people in this guerrilla warfare fighting style is a man named Francis Marion. Francis Marion ended up being a very great leader because of this style, guerrilla warfare fighting. He would hide his troops in the swamps of the South. They'd pop out in small groups, fighting against the British. Little attacks, retreat. Little attacks, go and hide. Little attacks, retreat. Because of this, he was given the nickname Swamp Fox. Right? He was quick like a fox, and they were in the swampy areas of the South. So Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox. So not only, scholars, did that fighting happen at or in the South, fighting also moved out into the ocean, out at sea. Now you'll remember when the Netherlands and Spain became allies to the American side, right, the Continental Army, there was now fighting going on in Europe between Britain and Spain. Well, that fighting is also going on at sea. John Paul Jones, pictured here, was commander of an American warship named the Bonhomme Richard. So an American warship, but you'll remember, scholars, when we talked a while back about British and American advantages, Britain's warships, Navy, outnumbered the American warships and Navy 100-1, right? So they're very outnumbered. So this is an interesting battle for us to discuss. This victory at sea relates to John Paul Jones and his ship, the Bonhomme Richard. So his ship met up with a British ship called the Serapis, and they began fighting in the Atlantic Ocean, actually closer to Great Britain than to the colonies. As they're fighting, battling, it is not going well for John Paul Jones and the crew of the Bonhomme Richard. Cannonballs are being volleyed back and forth. The British were winning the battle. Things were definitely not looking good for the American side. So much so that the commander of the Serapis demanded that John Paul Jones and his crew surrender. Their ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was even on fire when he was told to surrender. So think about that for a moment. You're out at sea and in the Atlantic Ocean. Your ship is on fire. You're being told to surrender. Right? This is not looking good. You sink, you burn, you surrender, right? Not a lot of options. But scholars, here is why this battle at sea is so important. When things were down, not looking good, John Paul Jones did not surrender. He did not go down with the ship. He said instead, I have not yet begun to fight. And then he and his crew continued battling while the Bonhomme Richard was aflame. And he and his crew managed to board the Serapis and take it over as the Bonhomme Richard burned. Pretty impressive. And again, scholars, famous words, right? Kind of motivating not only his soldiers, crew members, but it goes on to inspire others later, right? This idea of the chips are down, it's not looking good, but he doesn't give up, right? Fortitude comes to my mind. I have not yet begun to fight. And then they take over the British ship. Pretty awesome. Here's a painting by Paul Walsh, the Bonhomme Richard engaging the Serapis in battle. Now to the second part of our study, when I told you about the traitor. Benedict Arnold is his name. Let me tell you his story today. So Benedict Arnold was one of George Washington's bravest, finest generals. He had helped in the Battle of Saratoga. Now, remember, that Battle of Saratoga actually happened with General Gates's army. But I want you to think back a little bit. The Battle of Saratoga was the one where the British had that plan for the three forces to surround General Gates's American army in Albany. Do you remember that battle? The battle where they were all going to surround Gates, but General Howe decided first to swing down to Philadelphia and capture it, and in doing so, ended up not following the plan. And General St. Leger, remember, coming from the Great Lakes area, ended up engaging in battle with some patriots and also did not make it to the meeting spot in Albany. So that battle ended up being between General Gates and General Burgoyne. And that battle resulted in the American side winning. General Gates' army won. And General Burgoyne and his 6,000 soldiers surrendered. That Battle of Saratoga, where that victory for the Americans brought about the allies of the French, the Spanish, and the Netherlands? Yes, that battle. Well, scholars, that battle in part was won because of the help of this fine general named Benedict Arnold. Now, as kind of a thank you, right, a reward for this great work in the Battle of Saratoga, George Washington placed him in command of a fort right along the Hudson River. That fort was known as West Point. Now, a little bit about Benedict Arnold. So he's now in charge of this American fort. Well, here's what you should know about Benedict Arnold. A little background. Benedict Arnold liked to spend money. He liked to live the fancy life, the life of luxury, living beyond his means, right? Meaning he lived in a way that he really could not afford to live. He wanted people to think of him as wealthy, right? As powerful, as important, a bigger life than he could actually afford. Now, in doing that, he ended up, of course, racking up some debts and got even more and more money hungry. That leads him to some trouble. Now, he's in this trouble. He needs more money. He wants more money. He wants to continue living this lifestyle that he's created for himself. How to get some money? That's what leads to him being a traitor. So he wanted to make more money to pay for these expensive things that he was liking so much. So he contacted the British and made them an offer. He said he would give the British West Point, not fight in a battle and the British win the fort. He would give them the fort in exchange for some money. So basically, he's trying to sell the fort that's not really his. The fort that George Washington has entrusted him to command. Imagine that. Imagine being entrusted for something so important and then offering to sell it for some money. That's what happened with Benedict Arnold. He has now contacted the British. He's offering to give them the fort in exchange for money. Money that would allow him to live the life that he wants, that he's been trying to live. Well, one of George Washington's favorites, this brave, fine general, in doing this, became a traitor against the American side, against the Continental Army, against this patriot movement. Now, luckily, the plot was discovered and stopped in time, but Benedict Arnold himself escaped and joined the British side, then working to help them. George Washington and the American side were quite shocked by this treason. It is said by historians that George Washington himself took this very hard. One of his most trusted advisors, someone he himself placed in this commanding role, doing something so treasonous, right? Something against this movement, really shook him. So shocking, saddening that Benedict Arnold did this, right? He's probably one of the, as I mentioned at the beginning, most famous traitors in history. Right? Going from this important role in the American army, the American side of the revolution, due to greed, becoming a traitor. So let's check on what we did today. We learned about where the fighting spread beyond New England into the colonies of the South, out to sea. If there were a couple of big things to remember there, it would be, right, Francis Marion, the swamp fox, and his guerrilla warfare, right? Popping out, fighting, retreating and hiding. Popping out and fighting, retreating and hiding. And John Paul Jones and the Bonhomme Richard, right? Looking like it was going to be a surrender as their ship was burning and sinking. But instead, he says, "I have not yet begun to fight." And he and his crew managed to overtake the British ship, the Serapis. And then, of course, we learned about the traitor. You remember his name. Say it with me. Get ready. Yes, Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, a trusted advisor, finest in General Washington's command, placed in charge of West Point, and then offers to sell it to the British to support his greedy lifestyle. It gets found out, but he gets away and then aids the British. All right, scholars, I want you to remember your task now is to open the attached Google form, answer those 5 questions about today's lesson, lesson 19. Please remember, click submit at the bottom of that Google form. If you just click turn it in, it shows you turned in the assignment, but your questions do not get submitted, or sorry, your answers do not get submitted unless you click that submit button at the bottom of the Google form. Thanks for joining me, scholars. Our next lesson, lesson 20, is the last lesson of our American Revolution study. Stay tuned.